Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis, your favorite YouTube show / podcast about Gnosticism, the esoteric, magic, mysticism, esoteric religion, whatever else we feel like talking about. I'm Deacon Jonathan Stewart. I'm joined by my co-host, Bishop Laney Peterson. Hi, Bishop.
How you doing today, Deacon?
As good as one can be. As always, as we've been saying a lot, as good as one can be for the end of the world.
Yeah.
But, the good thing about being a Gnostic, and I haven't been involved with Gnosticism as long as you have, but I'm coming up on about a decade, and it's good preparation for the moment. Belonging to a belief system that talks about being imprisoned in a negative plane of reality. Good preparation for what's happening now.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's one thing when it's sci-fi.
Yeah.
It's quite another when you're actually experiencing it. In some cases, quite literally. And I don't like the overuse of that word, but in this case, people are imprisoned in their own homes in many cases. You can't, you can't leave, and in some cases, that's being enforced by law enforcement. So yes, we're in quite a time right now.
Quite a time. It's also funny that you mentioned science fiction because I often, I've been working from home. I've been working remotely. It's me and my partner and my cat. We're spending lots of quality time together. I'm sure I'll be found with many stab wounds. But I've often been saying to my imprisoned partner,
stab wounds and the cat gnawing on you. Yeah, okay.
That's right. That this is. You mentioned sci-fi. Like, our present reality is so much like every cyberpunk dystopian novel from the 90s that it's almost hack. Like it lines up just a little too closely. So
I recently treated myself to the full DVD collection of Blake 7.
Oh.
I don't know if you ever saw that.
Oh, I have, but like one or two episodes, the late
it was and it was here, and it's very hard to find, but it's definitely this dystopian thing. I decided to treat myself to the whole collection, and I'm watching it, and it's like, oh.
It's like watching a documentary or the news.
Yeah, exactly. So.
Yeah. So tonight we have a very special guest. It's me and Bishop Peterson, our favorite guests. Back for another question and answer.
We're one guest. We're actually just one half of the symbiotic male female dualistic.
The syzygy. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
exactly. So one guest. The syzygy. We asked for our for audience questions. We got a bunch of doozies. You really gave us a workout this time.
Yes.
Yeah. We have a very intelligent, literate, smart fan base who have really gone in depth this time, so we're going to do our best. As per usual, of course, we're both members of separate churches. Anything I say is just my personal opinion. It doesn't represent my entire faith community, and of course, even if I am, it's coming from me. So even if I was speaking on behalf of something else, which I'm not, of course, you figure out your own answers. And because Bishop Laney's the head of her own church, I guess anything you say would be canon.
Tell that to my clergy. I think there would be a great uprising. But no, anything I say is my own opinion, and that can change, and it often does.
It often does. Yeah, we could just do these. The good thing about these questions is we don't even need to get new ones, because we could just do it again next month and we'll have totally different answers. So
I agree.
Yeah. So I'll launch right into it with the first question, which is from Lux01. How do you think history and the trajectory of the church might have changed if Valentinus, that's how I like saying his name, it's also Valentius, or however you want to say it. I like saying Valentinus because it reminds you of Valentine. How might the history and trajectory of the church, capital C, have changed if Valentinus had become pope?
I'm hesitant to answer the question because it's a very historical question, and I'm not really comfortable necessarily making that kind of prediction when there are a lot of people who know a lot more about the history of that period and that sort of thing. I have to wonder if the church would have, if that had kind of formed in that direction, would it have succumbed to empire the way it did? Would
Yeah.
it have become, united with empire? And there's another science sci-fi plot, that oftentimes they do focus around empire. And we saw that, we've got Jesus who is railing against empire. You read the Revelation of John, and again, it's this anti-empire. And if you look at various Gnostic writings, and again, there are multiple schools of thought. They were not in agreement any more than you and I are in agreement. But there was often that real sense of empire as evil. And they understood, if you understand a demiurge as this blind ruler that proclaims to be the leader of people that he doesn't even know, there's empire for you.
Exactly.
So I have to wonder, would there had been this enmeshment between empire and church? And that's, I think, where the real evil is. When people rail against institutional religion, I sometimes think that maybe they're railing against the enmeshment of religion and empire.
Exactly. And of course, it is in many ways an unanswerable question, but going back to when you mentioning sci-fi, this is what you'd call an alternate reality.
Yeah.
And for those who don't have the background, Valentinus was a great Gnostic leader, formed one of the largest of the schools of Gnosticism, and there is a story that he had almost become the Bishop of Rome, which would have made him the Pope, which also shows you that this is very on in the first century, that these lines between Gnosticism and Proto-Orthodoxy and different schools of Christianity and religion were very thin. Supposedly, he did have a huge impact both on Gnosticism and Orthodoxy. There is a story that he really introduced the concept and the doctrine of the Trinity. So I think I just have to agree with Bishop Laney, and my answer would be I don't think the church would have become enmeshed with empire. But what would have happened afterwards? Maybe a different religion would have become the religion of empire and would have crushed the Church of Valentinus, right? And then we would be the Mithraism would have become the main religion. Who knows?
And
I
would
think
that have been such a terrible, horrible thing?
yes.
What would have
Yeah,
happened if what we call Christianity remained a living but minority religion?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
And there's
And I
plenty
think
of religions that have existed, that are much older than Christianity. They are living minority religions that continue to this day.
yeah.
Many, many, many. And there's some that are major world religions as well. So what would have happened? It's an interesting question.
Oh, it's definitely a fascinating question, and I'm glad they submitted it. And we'll plug ourselves into our alternate reality matrix. And there are actually serious scientists who believe that alternate realities are true.
Yeah.
That they're lined up next to ours, so maybe we can peer into the one where Valentinus did become pope. Before I do move on, I mean, if you're looking, both you, Luxo1, and the audience is looking for a more in-depth answer, I think some of the answers would be in Elaine Pagel's classic the Gnostic Gospels, because she doesn't quite do an alternate history, far from it, but she does talk about how Christianity would have been very different, had very different beliefs that would have impacted the societies that it shaped in different hierarchical ways if the Gnostic schools have become the more dominant forms of religion, right? The more dominant forms of Christianity. So she does talk about, well, maybe perhaps Christianity would have had a better relationship with women and more women leaders, and it would have had this, and it would have had this, and it would have had this impact on society. She does go into that a bit in the Gnostic Gospels. Some people do see that book as outdated, but I love it. I think it's a classic for a reason. It's very easy to find. It was a big New York Times bestseller. So if you haven't read that and you're looking for a more in-depth answer, track that classic by Elaine Pagels down.
It's a pioneering work.
Yeah.
It's definitely it's been rightly subjected to criticism, which is what you do with scholarship.
Exactly.
And a lot of people don't understand that scholarship is a process. And particularly people like Karen King and Elaine Pagels were definitely pioneers, and they wrote their stuff, and then they've gone back and forth with it, as have other people. It's engaging work.
Yes. Yeah. And it's the way that it should be.
Yeah.
Okay. So moving on, how can one differentiate between temptation and divine beauty? And then there's sort of the writer, which is the questioner, which is A Brown 1027, continues: as a young lover of nature, it's been difficult for me to tell between what is quote unquote good about the physical realm, between what is quote unquote bad or destructive. Want to jump into that one, Bishop?
Well, okay, my first response is 2 words: murder hornets.
Yes.
Which is actually very mean-spirited of me. I've struggled a lot with that because I like nature, I like the outdoors, I like animals, I'm always talking up the nature preserve that the city put near my home. I live kind of on a great residential area, ugly commercial strip, but they gave us our own nature preserve, and it's absolutely glorious. So I'm very, actually, more that I calmed down and started really working with that question, a lot came, and there's different, again, there are different perspectives. There are some Gnostics who believe that, look, you're born into matter as a way of refining who you are. Your soul is being subjected to refinement. Matter isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily evil, but it is something that we struggle with and against. We try to work within it. We try to push against it and resist it. And that's what forms your soul. So that can't be entirely evil. And then there are other Gnostics that I know who basically say, look, what you're seeing is a glamour. The beauty that you're seeing is a glamour. There's this ongoing process of death and suffering and devouring and pain, and the strong devouring the weak, and it's relentless. And so when you're seeing things and everything seems to be pretty, you're just seeing what you've been conditioned to see. You're not actually showing any real knowledge of what nature is. Yeah. And then I kind of started thinking back to some periods of my time. I was listening to some tunes from the 80s and the 90s, reminding me of some what I thought were very happy days. And then I began to meditate on the songs and the times that they brought up, and I began to realize what was going on was perhaps not as pretty, or not as nice, or should not have made me as happy as it did, because there was some real dysfunction there. Yeah. So one thing that occurred to me is that there is this thing called wisdom that we can acquire over the years. And when we look back on things that appeared to be beautiful or appeared to be pretty, with an understanding of what was going on there, they may not be that way. Now, I know I'm veering a little bit from nature here, but right now in the US and in Canada and in some other places, there is a real reckoning with history going on. Mm-hmm. Histories that, on one hand, we grew up with in the US, the red, white, and blue, fireworks, celebrations, and there is this history is now being put forth as not being as beautiful as we thought it was, and that's the kind of knowledge that can develop when one is willing to allow oneself to be shaped by wisdom. So I would say that there's a couple of different levels here. There is nature, the natural world, the non-human world, and that can be its own form of trap. Again, murder hornets and viruses. And then there is that also looking at our own mythologies that are born of human behavior, and again going back and saying, was this really as beautiful as you thought it was? So those were some of my musings from yesterday. I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
Oh, for sure. Well, just to build on what you're saying, there's nothing more Gnostic than talking about the development, the testing, and the growing of wisdom, right? That is the Gnostic myth. It is about wisdom, Sophia, falling into matter partly, right? And the growth therefrom. So just putting an asterisk on what you're saying, because I think that is spot on when it comes to a very Gnostic outlook. And again, I'm going to be saying this a lot this show. These are very difficult questions. We're glad that.
I got very angry when I got them yesterday with less than 24 hours, and Deacon Jonathan was the target of my wrath, for which I do apologize. But no, I mean, these are the kind of questions. Again, they've actually been giving me a lot of food from my own meditations and ponderings, and so I thank those who are asking these very difficult questions.
Yes. Oh, they're very excellent questions, very deep. So you can tell that these are some people who are very engaged with Gnostic topics.
Yeah.
So how can one differentiate between temptation and divine beauty? This is not just a Gnostic problem, but something that the great ethicists and philosophers and religious thinkers of thousands of years in all cultures have been grappling with, right? And I guess I would say, that there is that saying from the Bible, Satan, Lucifer can appear as a great angel of light. Sometimes the beauty can entrap us, and we live in this really tricky world where, okay, so having a couple glasses of wine with some friends on a hot summer night, having some deep conversations, bonding, that's one of the, in my opinion, one of the greatest experiences that a human can have. And if you don't drink, obviously you can still have your own version of that experience, but it's wonderful, and you could really, souls could really connect, ideas can really be exchanged. So that's beautiful. But if you have that same situation where you're drinking a couple bottles of wine every night, then that exact same act has now become something that is bad, right? Making love, having sex, in my opinion, is pretty awesome. Perhaps becoming a sex addict or a sexual assaulter is a bad thing. So
Not perhaps, I would say, particularly when it comes to being the assaulter. Yeah, that's pretty definite.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty definite. Yes, I was being
The
a
murder
bit.
hornets after them. Yeah.
Yeah, being a bit facetious with the perhaps there. Definitely a bad thing. Definitely a bad thing, watchers and listeners. So we live in this very strange world where the exact same thing, well, they're not the exact same thing, but this thing that gives us pleasure and makes life worth living can also be destructive, right?
Yeah.
So how do we differentiate between temptation and divine beauty? It is looking at developing this wisdom again for the. Am I taking this to an extreme? Am I doing it in moderation? Am I hurting myself and others? So I think that's an important thing to differentiate between temptation and divine beauty. Now, moving on to the nature part, and we've talked about this on the show before, and I think Bishop Blaney had some really deep thoughts about this. And again, hashtag murder hornets. Putting the nature is very complicated, and I think Gnostics, in my opinion, should appreciate the beauty of the world around us, even if it is a trap. I don't think it's entirely a glamour, because in a lot of the Gnostic myths, the world is at least a copy of something beautiful and wonderful. It's a flawed copy, perhaps a bad copy, but it's still a copy of something pretty awesome. And in many schools of Gnosticism, divinity is trapped within everything. So you can sort of look at the world around you and appreciate, and I know this sounds like a paradox, that it can be a trap, that there's murder hornets and parasites eating the eyes of children. But at the same time, remember that it is a prison for divinity, and it is a copy of something that is beautiful. So you can look at that sunset and that tree and what have you, and have even mystical experiences. I'm sure we've all been in nature and been moved by the power of it. So again, not a clear answer, kind of depending on the situation and through the goggles and the eyes of wisdom for differentiating and working with what we have. So that's my answer for that. Thank you, A Brown 1027. We'll move on here. Given how there's so much between our tiny world and the heavens, is it possible that there could be multiple demiurges? And if so, would they exist trying to dictate their own material realities, or would they try to mingle and mess around with another's creations? And that's from Dreaming Serpent. And Bishop, do you mind if I go first on this one?
Please. It's a great question. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Awesome question. Well, I will say that we can't find this perspective exactly in some ancient Gnostic thought, but we do kind of find it in some of the schools, because in some of the earliest layers of Jewish Gnosticism and Christian Gnosticism, we don't often have a central demiurge figure. In many of the early schools, it's evil angels or fallen angels, or sometimes it's angels who are neither evil nor fallen, but who are quite far from the unknown father, from the unknown parent, far from the center of true divinity, and are a little bit mixed up and bad at their job. Okay? So we'll just go with evil angels. But these evil angels are the ones who create reality and trap us here. And in this ancient thought, these angels are all equal demiurges. And something else that's sort of borrowed from the cultures around them and already found in mystical Judaism and mystical Christianity is that the universe is kind of like an onion with different layers. And each of these evil angels, they made the world together and they run it, but they're specifically in charge of one of these layers or levels or heavens. Okay, so this question actually does kind of sound like some of these early versions of Gnosticism. So could there be multiple demiurges? Yes. And not only that, they do have their own levels, their own realities that they're in charge of. And would they exist trying to dictate their own material realities, or would they try to mingle and mess around with each other's creations? Sure. I mean, why would you be, if that's the kind of being you are and the kind of universe you're living in, why would you just be happy with just one level? And of course, this is linked to Gnostic ascent, because you have this idea, even when you have the central demiurge and then he has his archons under him, that you're trying to get through all these different levels that have been set up to trap you here, and get to the supreme reality. And before I stop talking, I should have taken some time to research this, but I know in even within the school of Valentinus, which we already talked about, there is also splintered into some different schools, as always.
That's what happens.
Yeah, it's what happens. And as always, Gnosticism is always so complex. And I know one of those schools, and I'm very fuzzy on this, perhaps I can find a research link and put it in our notes. They did believe in a couple different demiurges, some of which were more good than others, and some different levels of demiurges. So I know that was also a belief of some of the schools of Valentinus. So that's me on that one, Bishop.
I think that's fantastic, and I think you just put that incredibly well. The only thing that I would personally add is that there's also the, shall we say, demiurgic God talker in our own heads.
Yeah.
So many people find themselves being tormented by their own image of God. That if you grew up in a family or in a church or a religious organization in which God is this punisher, God is constantly trying to torment you, telling you to not do the things that you want to do, or telling you to do things that that sort of thing. Telling you to do things that you don't want to do, and trying to deny you joy, telling you to stay in an abusive relationship, telling you to not seek justice. A lot of people struggle with that, yeah. And to me, that is demiurgic in its own right. It may not necessarily be an intervention by a divine or semi-divine being, but it may also be that first layer. You were talking about onion layers. There is that first layer that many people on this path have to work with, and that is our own psyche, yeah. Which in and of itself reflects an oppressive empire, and may harm. And as a result, we have thoughts and ideas that are harmful to us, yeah. And to others, and that may be one of the very first things we need to work on. There's an old esoteric maxim, first know thyself, mm-hmm. And so that is present as well. So that's the only thing I would have to add.
Oh, and that's a great addition. Amen, Bishop. Before I move on, I'll also say for some of the viewers out there and listeners who aren't aware, what Bishop Laney is saying sounds very modern or almost postmodern or psychological, but I think that perspective is exactly what the ancient Gnostics are going for. They're always using psychological metaphors and describing the divine realities in terms of thought processes and giant brains. And for me, particularly with the Sethian material, the Secret Book of John, it's impossible not to read it as both a manual and a description for what goes on within the human mind. Now, is it just that? Absolutely not. That's why it's more than just the psychological text, right? The text is saying this is what's going on inside of your own brain, and you got that personal demiurge, as egoic force that is partly shaped by the human condition and by toxic societies, and you got to deal with that first, and then, as above, so below, that's also reflected in our exterior reality. So, to bring it back to the specific question, you could say that there's 6 billion demiurges, and they're all messing around with each other's creations, because we all create our own realities. The demiurge in our head creates our own reality, so that could be another way of looking at it. So that's 6 billion, 7 billion of them wandering around. Okay, so the next question is, do we have an idea of how many Hylics exist in this world, and are they really no more than finite material? And that's from Leo Ryo.
All right. I think, Deacon Jonathan, maybe you want to explain what Hylic is. And
Yes.
just go through the whole thing so that people who are listening, I mean, I would be happy to do it myself, but you do a very good job of explaining things.
Yes. Okay, so the ancient Gnostics, I should have written this down, but many of the ancient Gnostics thought that people were born as one of three kinds of people, and that is in many ways immutable. And there was the Hylics, the Pneumatics, and the Psychics. Okay. The Hylics are almost pure matter. They perhaps don't even have the divine spark in them. And then I'm going to mix this up, the Psychics and the Pneumatics. I'll say the Psychics. The Psychics have a spark of the spark, and they have the potential to develop into divine beings and Gnostics. And then the last category are the Gnostics. They're born of a full divine spark, and they have a better chance of becoming fully divine, a better chance of becoming enlightened. They sort of have inherent qualities born to them that allow them to become bodhisattvas, saints, ascended beings, however you want to phrase it. Okay.
Yeah. Pneumatic spirit. Yeah.
So to start with this, I've said this before on the show, but it's one of my favorite rants. And hey, this is our show. We don't have a guest. We have this idea. It partly comes from theosophy. It partly comes from all sorts of places. That there was once a perfect religion that exists outside of our present values, that we can recover, that has no moral problems and doesn't have to be adjusted for present times. Okay, this is a very common idea that even if we don't believe that we believe it, a lot of us believe it, and we go looking. So we're like, well, Buddhism must be a perfect religion. It doesn't have all this bad stuff in it, this racism, this sexism. Then you go and you read some early Buddhist texts, and your eyes pop out because some of them are horribly misogynistic, right? I'm not picking on Buddhism. This goes for any faith that is not from right now, and it'll also go from any faith that's from now when people are looking at it 1,000 years from now. Okay, every faith, even our precious Gnosticism, even though I think it's the best one, is going to be shaped by the culture that it arrives in. It's going to be shaped by the moralities of the day, and it's going to have some awesome ideas, and it's going to have some very bad ideas that we have to struggle with as modern people. Okay, so a lot of people, when they first come to Gnosticism, they hear about Gnosticism, they think that it is this perfect religion, the original form of Christianity before all the bad empire stuff came into it. And I think that it is pretty awesome. And sometimes I don't even think it's a religion. I think it's a meta commentary on religion. In that way, always engages and surpasses other forms of religion. Even though I in no way think I'm superior, and I think all religions are paths. So this idea of people being inherently one of these three things, and it being sort of predestination, and you're born this way, and the Hylics cannot change it no matter what, because that's what some of the ancient Gnostics thought. Not all of them, just some of them thought that the Hylics were completely lost. And were just basically matter, or kind of like robots. They didn't have the divine spark, pure creations of the demiurge. I think that's a very dangerous idea, right? And I think it's a bad idea, and I think we should make sure that it is out of Gnosticism forever. Now, how we can adapt that idea, and what a lot of ancient Gnostics do, is they actually see modern humanity as always being in flux, as we're shifting between these three states, right? So perhaps we start off as Hylics, then we become Psychics, then Pneumatics, or perhaps it's a little bit more unstable, and we sort of move through these three qualities. And perhaps some of us do have attributes that push us towards one or another, or we've been brought up in a certain way that pushes us up towards one or another. So I guess I just said we should get rid of the concept, but when we think about it like that, and we reinterpret this concept, which I think is another important thing for modern people to do with ancient religions, is we don't want to abandon every concept and throw it in the garbage and start from scratch. It's important to reinterpret them for the modern day. I think this is a good way for working with these concepts, and as far as I know, it's what just about every modern Gnostic does. It still uses this terminology. I have yet to meet a practicing Gnostic who strictly believes in Hylic, Psychic, and Pneumatic, and thinks that the Hylics are without the divine spark and are lost. I have I'm sure there's somebody out there, but I haven't met them yet. And I think this idea that we move through all three of these states of being, and that it's more of a symbol, is a good one. So to answer Leo Rio's question, since I don't really believe in this category of Hylics, how many are there in the world? Are they really more than finite material? Well, they're not more than finite material, and I don't really believe in the concept, so I can't say how many there are. But if we sort of adapt the concept and we think of Hylic as being the state where we have no exposure to the Gnosis, well, then that's the majority of the world, right? To use perhaps some Gurdjieffian language, right? Most of us are asleep.
Yeah.
We don't even realize that we're
Food
asleep.
for the moon. Food for the
Yeah,
moon.
food for the
Yeah.
moon. Yeah, we have no idea that we're automatons. This is the vast majority of people, and this is me, almost 24/7, 23, 59, 7. Maybe I have that 1 minute a day. Maybe 1 minute a week into of deeper insight. So, what do you think, Bishop?
I think our friend and colleague, Bishop-elect Scott Rosbach, I think it's him who came up with the idea of that these are not people, categories of people, but categories of states. And that we can be Hylic sometime, and sometimes we are psychic, and sometimes we are pneumatic. And we can fall back and forth between these states, and and then it impacts every area of our life. Scripture study would be one thing. You read it as a Hylic, and you get what may be a very literal interpretation, and then you can move deeper into maybe psychological insights, and then of course you can glean the real spiritual food from the text. So I've often found that to be a very useful way of thinking. Like you, the idea of predestination. We're going to sort you off into types here, and that's it. There's nothing you can do about it. I find that to be, shall we say, distressing.
Yes.
To say the very least. That to me is very, very rigid. I can see where it would be a useful explanation for people who are feeling put down and want to believe that they are marginalized and misunderstood because they're superior to everybody else. And I think that can become very attractive. But I think that there's probably more to it than that. What I would say is that I do think there are some people who possibly through a combination of genetics and environment and personal circumstances and when you were born and that sort of thing may be, due to early development, more sensitive than others.
Yes, I agree.
And that can sometimes, there can be certain personality types, and then that can happen. Now, one of the curious things about early Christianity is it was described as a religion of women and slaves.
Yep.
And so where I'm going to look at it is I'm going to take I'm going to come at this a little differently, is that if you are born in a context of oppression, for example, you may actually be far more primed to be a psychic or a pneumatic in this particular tradition, because you are looking at empire and greed and dominance from the perspective of somebody who is actually being crushed underneath it. Yes. So that if fine, we can turn this. We can look at these states. We can look at these ways of being, but I would also like to shift that a little bit and to note that the early Christianity, which I would put early Gnosticism, I would lump that all in together. In fact, there's a little twist there, and it's not the people who are running society who are perhaps the more likely to be the pneumatics. In fact, they're more likely to be the Hylics, whereas the pneumatics may come from those who see things for what they are, or have the capacity for seeing things for how they are.
Yeah, and I think that is a very plain reading of a lot of the Gnostic texts that do adapt this framework, right? Is that the people in power are going to be the Hylics for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. Is Sikhism the continuation of Gnostic Christianity? That comes from the Takeover 2. I'll jump into this one. The quick answer I would say would be no. I'm not an expert in Sikhism. I did do my undergrad in religious studies. That was a long time ago. I'm very old. But what I remember of Sikhism, for those who aren't familiar with the faith, or Sikhism, Sikhs, however you want to pronunciate it, it is an Indian religion that comes from the late medieval period. And this is a very crude way of saying it. It's not quite accurate, but it sort of combines aspects of both Islam and Indian subcontinent religion. So some aspects of Islam, some aspects of Hinduism, to put it in a very crude way. I'm sure a lot of Sikhs wouldn't put it that way, but it does have these figures of gurus who sort of come out of this tradition and sort of have ideas and perspectives from both. Okay, so we do have a strong mystical tradition within Sikhism. So is Sikhism the direct continuation of Gnostic Christianity? You know, in a family sense, did the Gnostics move to India and become the Sikhs? I doubt that. Now, does Sikhism have some mystical aspects that resemble Gnostic Christianity? Do Sikhs have Gnostic experiences? Are some people out there reinterpreting the Sikh scriptures in a Gnostic way? For that, I would say 100%. Right? To be a Gnostic, to have Gnosis, to have Gnostic experiences, to have mystical experiences, you don't need to belong to the religion of quote-unquote Gnosticism. And Sikhism does have a very strong mystical tradition. It even has esoteric traditions, a lot of Western Kundalini yoga, which is quite popular among esotericists and occultists. That comes out of Sikhism. So that's my answer for that.
I know very little about Sikhism. I know, I know of the religion. I know very little. What I would like to say, as we've talked about on the show before, disaster and emergency management and preparation is my jam. It's one of my various interests. And I can say is that the Sikhs today are very active in feeding people who have been victims of disasters. This has got some very nice publicity, particularly out in California when there's been serious wildfires. The Sikh temples immediately went into action and were providing hot meals constantly, offering hot meals, free hot meals to people who were trying to escape the flames. They have a remarkable presence and reputation for caring for people in emergencies. I believe that there is a religious tenet about feeding the hungry, and I think that is one of the things that we can look at. That center is what I would consider to be the center of any good religion, is right action, and that means caring for the vulnerable, whatever that vulnerability is. You care for the vulnerable. You meet their needs to the best that you can. And Sikhs, certainly here in the United States, and I'm sure around the world, clearly do that.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, moving on to a question from Samuel James Humphrey. Is the archetype/character of Satan just a metaphor of humanity's animal nature, or does evil exist as something separate from humanity? So for that, I would say yes. What do you got to say?
Evil is certainly, yes. Evil is, I think, in some cases, a value judgment. Again, is the murder hornet evil?
Yeah.
Now, I mean, the causes in tremendous suffering, from what I've heard, and has certainly managed to scare people terribly. But is that evil? Now, some hardcore Gnostics, hardcore Sethians might say, yeah, it is. I mean, it shows you just how evil nature is. I mean, again, now we're getting into a pretty serious philosophical area here. Are we saying that nature itself, well, okay, that's nature, it's natural, you can't do anything about it, so it's not good, it's not bad, just what it is? Or are you going to say, no, nature is evil, this is the product of evil, the demiurge created this distorted copy that is causing immense suffering, that nature itself is evil? That's a really good question. And it goes against, I think, what a lot of people Certainly people with my kind of upbringing, I think probably yours, where nature is separate from human impulses. Human impulses or human behavior, well, that's evil. But non-human things, animals or non-human life or non-human forms like rocks and mountains or viruses or whatnot, we're not going to give that any morality. We're just going to say it's just what it is, and it is what it is. But if you wanted to take a very hardcore anti-materialist view of a hardcore Gnostic who says this is all evil, it's going to say, no, you can't separate that. You can't separate human tendencies from what else is going on. Humans are a product of this evil, nasty, suffering system. But the difference is humans have a choice, have a way out. We have potentially that spark that could lead us out of this, but this is all evil and nasty. So it's a good question. Now, as far as Satan is concerned, that's is it an archetype? Is Satan the god? The god of this world? And who is the god of this world? Is that a demiurge? Those are some other questions, and it would depend on the Gnostic school, and it would depend on the Gnostic school today. I tend more to the idea that Satan is actually something a little bit different from a demiurge. Satan for me is the accuser. I'm more likely to put Satan as that distorted view of God that we often keep in our brains, not necessarily the creation of the imperfect spiritual and physical realm, but more or less the accuser. And that I get from some of from the Gospels, where we have the Holy Spirit as an advocate versus Satan as an accuser.
Yes,
that's where I'm coming from. But I think it's an interesting question.
Oh, for sure, yeah, and it's one that we can go around and around on, but again has been addressed and struggled with in different forms, even if you're not going to put Satan in there, by all the great thinkers of the world. So unfortunately, Samuel James Humphrey, I'm not going to be able to give you a clear, definite answer on this. It is funny because I am a Gnostic. I am perhaps more dualistic than some, but I think there is a real danger of seeing evil separate from humanity and as something separate and definite, even if it is, okay, even if it is, because then if you say that this thing, this person, this act, this belief is evil, just no stops, no asterisks, then that can lead to a lot of problems. So I think we always, and it is difficult, we always have to be interrogating, we always have to be looking at circumstances, we always have to be in flux with dealing with evil. And that's tough, right? And I wish I could just point out a bunch of things and say, that's wrong, that's evil, this is good, it's never bad. It would definitely make my life a lot easier, but that's all I can say on that. And I do like Satan as the accuser. That's what Satan means, the word. And just like Bishop Lady was saying, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, in traditional Judaism, Satan is not fallen. Satan is actually an angel in God's court, and God's court is viewed at, imagined literally as a courthouse.
Well, if you look at the book of Job, I mean, if you look at the book, which is considered to be one of the oldest books in the canon, it's very amoral. And what is going on there is psychopathic. And so if we're going to be talking about notions of a demiurge, and who clearly does not have empathy, and who just does what he wants because he can, well, you're right there. So maybe a Gnostic study of the book of Job, and comparing it a bit with Jung's work and that sort of thing could be kind of interesting.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Well, maybe we'll do it on the show.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. Is classical Gnosticism, the demiurge, the archons, the whole myth, what have you, an attempt at trying to make sense of a Gnostic experience inside a mostly monotheistic religion of its time? And that's from Jason Mermel, Jason Mermaid, Jason Mamel. I'll jump right into that. Jason, of course, is a friend. Yes, he's a friend of the show. He's been on before. He'll be on again. Quick answer for that from me is yes. one of the theories about sort of the origins of Gnosticism is, and this is from April Taconic, blessed be her name, Saint April Taconic. In the Gnostic New Age, she talks about educated Platonic Jews around the time of Christ who are living in Alexandria, who are becoming interested in all the religions around them. They get initiated into the mystery religions of Egypt. Okay, so they're going into this dark temple at midnight, and they're being blindfolded, and they're going in, and they're having these powerful mystical experiences, a Gnostic experience, and this Gnostic experience changes their views on their religion and makes them reinterpret their mythology. So what's happening is that they're having an experience of the divine that is so powerful, it makes them reinterpret what the divine is, and they know inherently, they believe that parts of the religion they've been brought up with are true and accurate, and are a good guide for living their lives. This mythology is valuable to them, and they see it have practical value. But because of the experience that they've had, they have to readjust the mythology. So when they have this powerful experience of what true divinity is, they have to readjust the myth, because God has now become bigger than some of the tiny ideas of God that they had believed or had been taught before. Okay. By the way, this is not a criticism on Judaism, which has a great mystical tradition, just perhaps a particular framing or understanding of Judaism. So God has become bigger than what they thought God was. Because of a Gnostic experience that they've had in these temples. So they have to rewrite the myths. So that's how you get the demiurge, and then you have the true God above the demiurge, right? You're still keeping the primal myths, but you're reinterpreting them, you're making them work, and the other important thing about doing this is not just adjusting it because you've had an experience. It's also then going to help other people, right? Because not everybody can get to that temple in Egypt. Not everybody is going to be initiated that way. And not everybody is going to have this powerful Gnostic experience. But if you readjust the myth, it becomes a map for other people to get to where you went. So quick answer for that is yes. You got one on that, Bishop?
I think you just did a great job.
Thanks.
I think you just did a great job, and I am. That kind of brings up the question. Okay, so why the revival of what was essentially a dead religious movement in modern day? And I mean, of course, we have. I mean, and the thing is that okay, yes, we did have the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Gospels, which and it happened at a time when the world was really rapidly changing. A lot of our institutions and beliefs were being, reconsidered and plowed under, and there was new things springing up. So there was that. But of course, there were other Gnostic scriptures that had survived and were still available. And of course, there were the heresiologists who had in many cases preserved a fair amount of the teaching pretty well. And we know that, there was that various esoteric movements that borrowed from all of this. So, I'm kind of asking the question today: is an interest in Gnosticism and trying to, if not turn it into a full-blown living religion, at least borrowing from it in various alternative religious traditions, is this its own expression of something that has happened? And something that's happened in the psyches of people who are often living in countries that are largely secular. Mm-hmm. What is that process as well? And many people are increasingly feeling distance from their government. We were having protests not simply here in the U.S., but all over the world. We have nothing on France. For what from what they've been getting up to. When you have the firefighters going out and setting themselves on fire and then beating up the police officers, hey,
that's
yeah,
that's a real protest. That's hardcore. I gotta say, yeah, that's pretty hardcore.
That's pretty hardcore. So, so it's an interesting, why then, why now?
Yes, and I will finish up with this question that I agree that I there is obviously solid reasons why Gnosticism is coming back. Yeah. And it's not just a coincidence, and it's not just a fad, and it does have to do with conditions here on the ground. And hopefully it has to do with Sophia. hopefully,
Oh,
hopefully she's in motion because of what's going on. Which brings us to our last and final question, and we're almost out of time, but I hope we can get this one in. It's even though it's a deep one, it's a long one, but we'll do our best. It's from another friend of the show, Stuart Cardell, who we often see on social media. So thanks, Stuart. We appreciate your support, and we always love seeing you in all the regular places. And obviously, I'll get you to answer this one first, Bishop.
of
Why
course you
does
will.
Yep. Why does Gnosticism still blame the female for causing all the trouble?
We cause all the trouble.
There we go.
See, we have all the power. You see, when you blame us for everything, we're actually the only people who are in power, and that just shows how powerful we are. I think that there's a couple of things here. I mean, I think that this was perhaps a tendency, and we still have a tendency today to sometimes blame women for the misbehavior of men. I mean, and we'll talk about the poor guy was a dope. She influenced him. But I think that there may have been more going on here.
Yes.
One may have been, we talk about these are psychological processes. We have the notion of the male as the active generative principle that, that has a thought. Mm-hmm. And then you have the forethought and the barbello, and then the two of them form that pair, and they're able to and then all of a sudden there's that reproduction. But there is that sense that the female is created by, or is the passive, the male is the active. Whether you like that or not, there it is. And you'll talk to some people today and they'll say, well, this doesn't actually hold with physical men and women. It's about, it's about a spiritual principle. I don't know that I entirely buy into that, but that's what folks will say. But there's a notion of what male and female is. Yeah. And so the tendency here is well, the male was primary, the male was first, so therefore has headship and therefore has priority. And anything bad that happened after that we're going to somehow or another insert the female who tried to take control over the situation herself. So, Sophia decided to go exploring. Some people have said, that she refused to have sex with her mate. Others have said, she made it her own descent. She wanted to check things out, which, if you think about it, wisdom is often born of a descent.
Yes.
If here we have a wisdom that has not yet descended. So that's an interesting question in of itself. How do you become wise without first making a descent? How does wisdom exist without that?
Exactly.
We know, we talk about age, with great age comes great wisdom. Now we know that's not always the truth, but there's almost always, when a person is wise, there's been a descent. So whether, I think that this may be some, to a degree, just plain sexism. Yep. And others, it's also their notion of what the hierarchy is and ought to be. And that when this principle decided to separate from the generative principle and the patriarch, that's how the trouble got started. And this is the story. I mean, this is the story that we're left with. I know, some people, Elaine Pagels thought that, Gnosticism may have been more of an egalitarian religion in the beginning. That has been questioned and challenged, and the debate goes on about that. I think that this is the tradition. This is what we know. We can receive it, and it doesn't mean we can't make any changes to it or that we can't work with it on our own. But again, we're receiving this at a time where there have been, worldwide efforts to bring about gender parity. So it's probably not surprising that we're looking at something here and identifying the problem.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. We got to grapple with the traditions. And what I'll say in closing is that, if you take Secret John, where, you could say it's the female's fault, it's Sophia's fault. But in Secret John, it's female figures that redeem us, right? It's epinoia, and in some versions of the myth, it's a higher aspect of Sophia. You have Eve in the Adam and Eve story in Secret John. Adam is a dumbass, and Eve is the redeemer, the genius, the one who sees through it, the one who takes the fruit that allows Gnosis to descend upon humanity and gives it to Adam. Some people have called Eve the first Gnostic saint. So is the female blamed for causing all the trouble? Like, yeah, you have the
Who's
myth of the
doing the
fall.
blaming?
Who's doing the blaming? You have
Who's doing the blaming?
have the myth of the fall of Sophia and Secret John, but then you have redemption by the female aspects. You have redemption by the higher Sophia, redemption by Epinoia, redemption by Eve, and of course, famously, if you're looking at sort of misogyny in religion, a lot of the Gnostic groups reinterpret the Adam and Eve story, where where Eve is the hero, right? Adam is the dumbass, and if we had just gone along the male principle, gone along with Adam, we'd just be stumbling around with our eyes closed in that garden. So
I will only say one thing: in the canonical Genesis, Adam remains the dumbass because it makes it clear in the story that she's talking to the serpent. Yep. She takes the fruit, eats it, gives some to her husband with her. So he was standing right there watching this whole thing while his wife is engaging with this serpent. And this is what happens. And then when God says, what happened here? Well, she gave me the fruit. And a lot of even very conservative preachers, in my experience, point that right out.
Yes, yeah, it's in the Kabbalistic tradition as well. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to end. I have to start remembering to do this also at the beginning of the show, but I hate filthy money. I hate to ask for it. I hate using it, but apparently, we are still in this world system. We haven't ascended to the pleroma yet. We do rent an awesome studio out of Chicago who makes this show amazing. Even when we weren't renting a studio, we always had bills to pay. So just to run the show, it unfortunately does take money. And I know that you, the viewer, the listener, listen and watch to a lot of podcasts, and I know they all beg you for money, but I hate to do this, but we got to do it. If you can support us on Patreon, that's patreon.com/Gnostic. It can be for as little as $1 per show. I do need to update the Patreon. What you get right now is your name at the end of the show, and you get all our content early. You get it up to sometimes longer, up to a week earlier than everybody else. And if we can think of something that's not exploitive, some other treasure that we can give you, we will. But we didn't want to lock any content behind paywalls, right? Because we don't think that is the right way to do things. But if you can support us, that would be amazing. And I know that these are hard times. So if you can't do that $1, then please just share the show, share it on your social media. And if you don't want to, yep, thank you. Like and subscribe. So please subscribe, leave good reviews on the podcatcher of your choice, and share the show. And if you don't have social media or don't want to share it on social media, just email it to somebody who you think might like it. Yeah,
we appreciate it.
Yeah, so that's us signing off. Thanks again, and thanks again for all the awesome questions. Feel free to submit questions to us for future versions of this show. We'll be periodically doing this. You can email them to me. You can put them in the comments and questions slot below. You can leave them on our Facebook, however you want to get them in. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.